last but not the least, he got his BTech or dual degree from Germany. So he's actually an alumni of IIT Bombay. So he works in security, especially in micro-architecture security. In fact, all his PhD research and post-PhD research are being around conferences. He also got SIGA Best Dissertation Award.
Honorable mention.
Post PhD.
Yes. Yeah.
So, but summary is he's a rising star in the field. So, it should not be so.
Thank you, Biswa, for the kind introduction. It's a really, it's my pleasure to be here speaking with all of you. I was not, I haven't visited this building before, but I have spent a lot of my time as an undergrad in other buildings of IIT. So yeah, it's happy to be here and be talking to all of you. Today I'm going to talk about security for microarchitecture. We'll talk about different components of microarchitectural security. But before we talk about the different ideas in this talk, let's first talk about what is microarchitectural security and why is it important. So let's do a thought experiment, right? Like if you have some valuable items, right? Cash, jewelry, where do you store it? You store it in a safe, right? And you hope that the safe is secure, right? Against any malicious activity. Well, safes can actually be broken if you think about it, if the underlying material is vulnerable. So for example, a safe cracker can simply take a stethoscope, move the dial of the safe and hear the vibrations coming from the surface of the safe, right? They can try to leak the combination of the safe by just listening to the vibrations the safe makes from the material, right? Or if the safe's material is very brittle, you can just take a hammer and break open the safe, right? So a safe is only as secure as its underlying material. And very similarly, our systems today are only as secure as the underlying hardware. We have many layers of software in which we think about security, but at the end of the day, they're running on processors, they're storing the data in memory, and if we have vulnerabilities at these layers, the entire security of the system breaks down. And we are seeing many emerging threats at this layer. For instance, we have side channel attacks where a malicious adversary can listen to side effects or maybe measure the side effects of software execution in hardware and leak information out of the hardware. More information than you can leak out of just the software. And classic examples are these vulnerabilities called Spectre, Meltdown that basically affected every single processor manufactured in the last 20 years. Similar to hammer-based attacks on safes, you have in memories you have something called row hammer, where if you hammer one location in memory, you can have enough charge leak out from neighboring locations and you can have bit flips in neighboring locations. So as chips are shrinking, we are seeing these new kinds of vulnerabilities like row hammer attacks that make bits that are stored as ones turn into zeros in memory. So we have these information leakage via side channels, we have fault injection attacks like row hammer. So this is becoming an emerging problem, right? So clearly microarchitectural security is important. But why worry about it now? Why today, right? Well, if you look at threats or hardware related threats, shown here on this graph is time, and on the y-axis is the number of papers that in top security conferences like Usenix Security or IEEE Security and Privacy, and the y-axis shows the percentage of papers that are hardware related or attacks that leverage hardware vulnerabilities. And you'll see that it's kind of on the rise, right? Like there was an inflection point around 2018 when Spectre and Meltdown came out, and since then there's only one direction to go, up and up. So hardware based attacks are growing and evolving, right? At the same time, we are of course facing this physical problem, like we are hitting physical limits while designing hardware. Shown here is the classic Moore's law where processor number of transistors on the processor doubled for several years, every year on year, and now we are hitting walls, right? We are hitting scalability laws, performance limits, and so on. And so it's becoming harder and harder to get the performance gains every year on year. So any defense that we put inside of our hardware, if it is costly, it's not going to be adopted, right? So we have this unique problem right now where attacks are evolving and it's becoming harder and harder to design efficient defenses. So we really need people at the intersection of these two areas to come up with not just principled defenses that mitigate these evolving attacks, but that are also practical to deploy, right? So that they can actually be implemented in today's or tomorrow's processors. One of the big challenges in this space is, well, how do we even understand these attacks? These processors are, expected to just work, right? Like we like to write C code, right? And the code that we write just should work. The vulnerabilities that come up are really coming up from the microarchitecture, the way the processor is implemented. Different processor manufacturers implement it different ways. So it's extremely hard to understand the threat landscape, right? You really need to reverse engineer these real processors, understand what's inside this black box, and then see how an existing attack might, have different variants, and basically try to understand this wide threat landscape, right? At the same time, if you understand the threat landscape and you want to come up with a defense, it's actually very difficult to not just build enduring defenses but also practical defenses, right? On one hand, you want to build a defense that not just mitigates one attack but a class of attacks, right? And also you only get to build your defense once, right? So you really have to anticipate how the attack is going to evolve in the next 5 years and then design your defense accordingly. So it's becoming very hard to build these enduring defenses. So in this talk, I'm going to give you a couple of examples of how we try to solve some of these challenges. First, on one side, on the attack side, I'm going to talk about a new attack that we discovered that impacts a wide range of AMD processors, all the way from Zen 1 to Zen 3 generation. So essentially, processors of the last 5 years. And on the defense side, I'm going to talk about MIRAGE, a cache side channel defense that tries to end an arms race in the space of cache side channel attacks. I'll talk a little bit about what a processor cache is and what are these side channel attacks briefly in the next few slides. Before diving deeper, I just wanted to make sure if there are any questions. Throughout the talk, please feel free to interrupt me at any point if you have any questions. We can take it as they come. All good so far? Okay. So let's dive into MIRAGE, which is a principled defense against cache side channels. But first, what is cache side channels? Or rather, what are caches? Well, you all know that code runs on processors, data stored in DRAM, and DRAM is extremely slow to access. It takes about a few hundred cycles to just get data back from DRAM. And in the meanwhile, the processor might just be stalled, sitting, idle, right? But that's not what we want. So we have processors that deploy these fast SRAM-based memories or caches, which are smaller, much smaller than DRAM, but are order of magnitude faster, right? So you can get data back in maybe tens of cycles. The challenge is that now you have this timing difference, right? Data sitting in the DRAM is slower, data sitting in the cache is faster, and so now you can learn what data is present in the cache and not present in the cache. This is something we call a timing side channel that allows you to learn more information about the microarchitecture than just by looking at the data itself, right? You can observe the side effects or timing of the execution from the cache to learn about something about the state of the cache. Why is this cache state even important, right? Well, this cache itself is shared between multiple cores. So you might have in a cloud system, you might have one core run by one particular process that or a VM that is controlled by a malicious adversary, and then another core that is running a program or a VM controlled by a victim, regular user, right? That is processing some sensitive data. And these share this last level cache. Cache itself is laid out in the form of sets and ways. So these are ways, these are sets, and addresses have a deterministic mapping from memory to cache set. So now if you have a limited space inside a cache set, the spy and the victim process contend for this limited cache space. You can have, of course, one process kicking out an address of another process from the cache set, right? Why is this again important? This is called a set conflict. Why is this important? Well, a classic attack called a prime and probe attack, shown from 2015 or even before that, showed that, well, if you have a spy process that fills a cache set, allows the victim to execute, victims might install a certain address that evicts one of the spy's address, and the spy then, based on monitoring the latency for this its own address, if it is slow, it knows that, well, the victim accessed this particular set, right? And because this set is indexed based on the address, there is a deterministic linkage between the victim's address and the set. If the victim's access was secret dependent, then the spy can also not just learn the address that the victim accessed, but also the secret that the victim used to calculate this address, right? So this kind of an attack has been shown to leak a bunch of information. So a spy that observes victim accesses can leak, let's say, keys out of encryption algorithms, can fingerprint websites that the user is browsing, or maybe even leak more sensitive information, like maybe the ML model architecture that the victim is running. So a wide variety of sensitive information can be leaked out through this cache side channel. An important criteria for observing the victim accesses in this case is this episode of set conflict, right? Where you have a spy's address, a set of addresses that map to this entire cache set that evicts the victim's address from this cache set deterministically. So the set of addresses that allow this eviction is called an eviction set. We'll see why this is important in a minute. So what are past approaches to defend against this? Well, naively, you can say, oh, I care about this contention patterns, let's just isolate processes across different regions of the cache, right? So build a wall, right, between victim process and the spy process. Each gets its own cache space, no contention, no information leakage. The problem is, well, if you're building this wall along ways, there are only a few ways in the cache, right? You can have 8 or 16 ways in the cache, and well, you can only have 8 or 16 partition. What if you have a 64 core processor? You really can't even have 64 partitions. So it's not scalable. The other approach people have used is, well, they try to randomize the mapping of addresses to cache sets so that, well, observing evictions leaks no information about, or at least the contention patterns are all obfuscated. So by observing which line address got evicted from the cache, it's very hard to know which address was installed, right? So if a spy's address gets evicted, maybe you don't know which victim address caused that eviction. Yes, question?
How do you know that some address is evicted? Like, how does the user know?
So the way a user knows, so in this case, right, the objective of the spy is to monitor whether its address got evicted or not. All the spy has to do is make a load for that particular address. Initially it was installed into the cache, so if there was no eviction, the access is going to be serviced very fast. If there was an eviction, the access is going to be slow, right? The timing difference is 10 cycles versus 200 cycles, right, for a given load. So by measuring the timing of a given load, you can know where it is being serviced from, right? If there was an eviction, it's not going to be serviced from the cache, it's going to be serviced from the DRAM. There was no eviction, it's going to be serviced from the cache, right? So timing differences tell you whether there was an eviction or not. Make sense? Okay, so, oops. Yeah, sure.
So the processor that's asking for this address, it doesn't know, it has to know that this is corrupted, right? Because you're corrupting this address, right?
Not quite. So we are not accessing, so let's say victim's address V is not even accessible to the spy, right? The spy only accesses its own addresses. So at that point you just have to read data, right? You're reading your own data and you're just measuring the timing, right? There is no corruption of the victim's data or even access to the victim's data. All you're doing is you're figuring out whether the victim's data is accessed or not accessed based on whether my own data got evicted from the cache. Make sense? So yeah, people have tried to propose these randomized caches where the address to set mapping is randomized so that eviction patterns get obfuscated and so you don't leak any useful information, right, about installed addresses by observing evictions. The problem is that several of these have been proposed in the last 5 years and all of them have gotten broken in a matter of months. So the question we asked is randomization even possible, like as a reasonable defense, right? That I mean, it's practical to implement, but if it's going to get broken, then what's the point, right? So can we even design principled randomization that provides reasonable security was the question. To answer this, let's understand how this arms race developed in the space of randomized caches. What were the prior defenses and why they broke, right? Maybe that provides some insight. So the arms race kind of started in 2015 where a paper proposed an eviction set discovery algorithm to discover this set of addresses that can evict a victim address deterministically from the cache on a proprietary Intel cache, right? So the attack that was developed itself took about order of n square accesses for a cache with n addresses. So if a cache has 10,000 addresses, you can construct this eviction set in maybe a minute and then you can have deterministic observability of evictions of a victim address. So this happened in 2015 and then in 2018 there was a proposal for a randomized cache called Caesar which said, okay, let me add a randomizing function here that basically obfuscates this mapping and let me change that mapping dynamically. So before this adversary can discover this eviction set, the mapping changes and well, the attack never succeeds, right? Well, with a new defense we had a new attack in a matter of 3 or 6 months. We had a new attack that converted this order of n square algorithm into an order of n algorithm. So this new attack basically succeeded in a millisecond, right? Before Caesar could change its mapping, the attack basically leaked out the eviction set and the mapping and the attack succeeded. Well, with a new attack, we had a new defense. With a faster attack, the defense guy said, okay, let's increase the search space for the attacker. So instead of one randomizing function, these defense used 2 randomizing functions and said, let me probabilistically use one of these for any new address that is installed. So the ability to evict an address deterministically from this cache became extremely hard because now you have to not just discover an eviction set that can evict it according to this function but also this function, right? And you need an eviction set that works for both functions simultaneously. So the search space for the attacker became extremely large and this attack no longer worked. Well, was this the end? Not really. This was a probabilistic defense, so people said, well, let me construct a probabilistic attack. They said, okay, I don't need a deterministic eviction set, but if I get an eviction set that can probabilistically work maybe 90% of the time, I'll just try a few more times, right? And they showed that you can have a probabilistic eviction set still in order of n accesses. So you still got the attack working, although it might not work 1 out of 100 times, right? Or 10 times out of 100, but most times it would work. So the key pitfall of all of these defenses, why they kept getting broken, was because, well, they obfuscated the pattern of set conflicts, but they continue to allow set conflicts to occur, right? So all it needed was a smarter adversary to come, construct a new attack algorithm that can leak the same information out, right? All they needed was time and intelligence, right? So to eliminate these attacks, we observed that, well, we need to eliminate set conflicts and these set associative evictions. So how do we do this? Well, the key idea in our paper, MIRAGE, is to say, well, don't use set associative caches, use fully associative caches. Fully associative cache essentially is where an address can map to any location in the cache and evict any address from the cache, right? So in Mirage, we provide this guarantee that when a new address is installed, a random address is evicted from among all of the addresses in the cache that leaks no information about the address that is installed, right? The placement and replacement are decoupled, okay? So you can see why this provides great security, right? Like the evictions are totally random from entire cache, leaks no information about addresses that are installed. The problem is that, well, fully associative caches are actually very, very expensive. Imagine if your address could map to any location in the cache, and your cache has about 10,000, 100,000 addresses. A last level cache is about 8 megabyte, 16 megabyte. So you might have like 100,000 locations in the cache to search for. So lookup becomes extremely expensive, right? Like you have to do 100,000 tag comparisons, and that might even be slower than just going to the DRAM. So, well, it's extremely impractical to look up a fully associative cache, that is for the last level cache, right? So ideally we want a set associative cache, that is what our baseline processors implement, right? Where a line can only map to maybe 16 or 32 locations within a single set. So your lookup is only 16 tag comparisons. So your lookup is inexpensive. So how do we get the best of both worlds? We want the security of a fully associative cache, but we want the lookup of a set associative cache. To answer this, let's think again about a thought experiment. Let's model this randomized set associative cache in the form of a classic bucket and balls problem. This is a classic problem in statistics where you throw balls randomly into buckets and measure the occupancy of the buckets. So in this case, cache sets of W capacity are replaced by buckets of W capacity, and balls that are randomly thrown into these buckets are nothing but addresses, right, that randomly map to cache sets. And now when you throw a ball into a bucket, if it overflows the capacity, you have to remove a ball, right, because the bucket overflows. This is nothing but set associative evictions that come out of a cache set, right? When you install a line, you need to remove a line. Similarly, when you install a ball, you remove a ball, right? So these bucket overflows are basically what leak information about which bucket the ball was installed in or which set the address was installed in that caused the eviction. So we want to minimize these bucket overflows. How do we do that? Well, let's consider 4 buckets with 4 capacity each, so 16 total capacity, and let's throw 16 balls into these buckets. Of course, you're going to have a bucket overflow every ball throw, right? Because, well, there is no, there is limited capacity, right? So you're going to have bucket overflows every ball throw. Now to reduce bucket overflows, what if we double the capacity of each of these buckets but store the same number of balls as original? So now as you imagine, well, each ball throw, there is some leftover capacity in each of these buckets, right? So you don't need to have a bucket overflow to remove a ball. You can in fact remove a ball from one of the buckets randomly, right? Like from among all of the buckets. You can have a global eviction from these buckets, which leaks no information about which bucket the ball has been installed in. But, well, with random ball throws, you can always have skews, right? So you're going to have a case where you still have bucket overflows. So although the probability of bucket overflows is reduced, skews in distribution can in fact lead to bucket overflows. What in 1996, Mizenmacher discovered this property of power of 2 random choices, where they said that, okay, what if you use, instead of 1 random choice, 2 random choices, and always picked the lower loaded bucket for installing your ball. What happens is that the loads in all of these buckets get very uniformly balanced, that you never have a scenario where one of the buckets kind of has an extremely skewed occupancy and bucket overflows. So if you have enough extra capacity and these 2 random choices and always pick the lower loaded bucket for installing, you get very balanced distributions and you can eliminate bucket overflows. So the question becomes, how much extra capacity do you need to provision to provide this property? So for this we modeled this behavior theoretically and empirically. Shown here on the x-axis is the extra capacity we provision per bucket. assuming a default capacity of 8. And on the y-axis we show how many times you need to throw balls before you get a bucket overflow. And you'll observe that with each unit increase in the bucket capacity, the number of balls you need to throw squares. So it starts from 10 power 1, goes to 10 power 2, 10 power 4, 10 power 8, 16, 10 power 32, right? So within just like 5 to 6 extra capacity per bucket, you reach an insanely large bound that you need to throw 10 power 32 balls. You need to have 10 power 32 ball throws before you get a bucket overflow. What does this mean about in the context of our caches, right? Well, with 75% extra capacity in each of these cache sets, you can get this guarantee that you need 10 power 34 address installs into the cache before you can get a set associative eviction or bucket overflow. In terms of time, this means like to do 10 power 34 installs, it takes even as high as 10 power 17 years, which is more than the lifetime of your universe, right? So in essence, as long as you have cache with 75% extra capacity and this power of two choices based install policy, you get very strong security guarantees that you're never going to have a bucket overflow or a set associative eviction, and all of the evictions coming out of your cache are going to be globally random evictions. Make sense? So we understand the security guarantees, but how do we implement this in our cache, right? We don't want buckets, we want caches, right? So one interesting observation is that provisioning extra capacity is expensive, right? Like the cache itself is stored in terms of two structures. The tag store, which stores the metadata of addresses, like which address, whether it is valid, whether it is dirty, and so on and so forth. And then it also, the data is stored in a separate structure. Tags, extra tags are cheap because it's just metadata. Extra data is actually very expensive, roughly in the ratio of 1:10. So getting extra capacity is very expensive, right? So what we thought, okay, let's break this one-to-one correspondence between tags and data, and let's only over provision the tag store while keeping the data store capacity the same. Because the tag store is what defines the placement of addresses in sets, right? So we really care about over provisioning the tag store. But as long as we have pointers to associate tags with data store entries, so we have a forward pointer to do this, and then a reverse pointer from data entries to go back to tags, we can actually get away with just over provisioning the tag store but not the data store. What this means is that, well, you can, with 75% extra tag store capacity, you only add about 20% extra storage for the cache itself. So you have extra capacity in the tag store, and you have these extra invalid tags in each cache set. So when a new address is coming in, it indexes into a particular cache set, and it finds, there is an invalid tag that I can just occupy, and I don't need to evict something from this cache set. Instead, you can evict a random selected entry from the data store, and then you can evict a random entry from the tag store based on this reverse pointer, right? So you, as long as a new line can install in the invalid tag, you can get the property that there are always going to be globally random evictions. So how then do you guarantee that there is always invalid tags within the index set? For that, we leverage the power of two choices indexing that we talked about. So the tag store itself is constructed in terms of two partitions or skews. A new address indexes into one set in each skew, and then it picks between these two sets intelligently. If it sees that the lower set has more invalid tags, it installs an address into that set, and this leads to a very balanced distribution of invalid tags across sets. And as long as you have 75% extra tags, you get the guarantee that, well, a new address is always going to find an invalid tag in its index set, and you'll never have a set associative eviction. All evictions are globally random from the cache. So MIRAGE requires about 20% extra storage for this strong security guarantee. In terms of performance, you might say, well, all of this randomization is adding extra functions that you need to compute. Well, it's not that much expensive. So shown here on the y-axis is normalized performance of MIRAGE, and another prior work scatter cache, normalized to a baseline cache without any randomization. And x-axis has a bunch of workloads, standard workloads from the spec benchmark suite. And you see that on average, Mirage has about a 2% slowdown, which is close to scatter cache, which had about 1.7% slowdown. And scatter cache actually got broken before it was even published, right? So in comparison, Mirage has stayed secure since its publication in 2020. So to summarize, Mirage has moderate to negligible slowdown of about 2% while providing strong security. So the takeaway here is that, well, you can indeed have really strong security guarantees of fully associative randomized evictions from the cache with practical set associative lookups with Mirage. This provides future-proof security because, well, the evictions are decoupled from installs, and the impact that this work has had is that from 2018 to 2020, as I mentioned, there were about 5 different defenses that got broken in a matter of months. Since 2020, Mirage has been unbroken. So if you all figure out a way to break Mirage, please tell me. That would be really exciting. Questions so far? Yes?
So even though you said the probability of a set-associative eviction is 1 in 10 to the power 17,
Yes.
so does that mean, is there hardware to deal with that, the off chance that it happens, even though it's very less likely?
That's a great question, right? It's actually 10 power 34. It's 1 in 10 power 17 years. But question is, well, what happens if there is a lucky chance that the adversary actually got a set-associative eviction? Well, in that case, you would actually know that there is a set-associative eviction, right? Because if you see that 2 sets, both in which the line was supposed to be installed in, are full, and I need to evict something from the same set and incur a set-associative eviction, hardware actually knows, well, something is wrong, right? Either adversary just got lucky, or maybe these functions got leaked somehow, right? Like maybe the keys got leaked that allowed the adversary to know these functions. In that case, you can just change the key. So these functions are in fact designed as ciphers with a secret key. So if you change the key, you get a new mapping. So if you discover a set-associative eviction happened, all the hardware needs to do is change the key and flush the cache and restart, right? So at that point, maybe it's going to slow down your system by a couple of seconds. But after that, the new mappings come in to play, and again, you probably have to wait for another 10 power 34 accesses before you're likely to get another set conflict. Yeah.
So just like you explained, so basically the bottleneck then becomes finding the key itself. So if adversary finds the key,
Yeah.
so basically you are mitigating the problem from rejects to the key itself. Like if you have to make the secure part that also.
Absolutely. So the security of this design essentially relies on the mapping staying secret, and hopefully the keys that you've used to generate this be secret. The good part is that you can do this entirely in hardware. The keys don't even need to be visible to the software. So the software, malicious software, doesn't even have a way to, try to probe the keys. They would literally have to, open up the processor and maybe probe some of the wires. And these keys also don't need to be the same for each processor. They can be different per processor. They can even change in time, like they could change every hour, every few minutes. So it's actually very hard for somebody to even guess the key or, construct algorithms that might leak the key out. Yeah.
So I'm assuming those functions are cryptographically secure, but
Yes. Yes. Yes.
what about using true random functions? We're dealing with hardware, it must be possible.
Yeah. So so we want randomness, but we also want determinism, right? Like we want an address that is installed in one location to also be accessible later on with the same lookup, same mapping, right? So we want a fixed mapping that is random, right? So you can definitely use a true random number generator to seed a function, right? Like you can generate your keys using a TRNG, but you can't just install it in a random location and then forget about it, because then you can't find it. Okay, so that was Mirage, right? So we talked about defense, where we are trying to defend against an existing attack. What about discovering new attacks? So this work that I'm going to talk about is called SQUIP. This was just published and presented at Oakland IEEE Security and Privacy in August, and was done in collaboration with students from TU Graz when I was visiting them for a summer. So the key exploit that we are focusing on is in out-of-order CPUs, particularly from the CPU scheduler. So what is a CPU scheduler? Architecture 101 class for those who have attended it or attending it. Most modern processors today are out-of-order processors. So you have instructions that are fetched, decoded in order, but they might execute out of order, right? This is basically what gives you performance, right? To execute out of order, you need to schedule instructions, right? You need to figure out when an instruction is ready, when its dependencies are being satisfied, and when the functional unit is free, and when it can be mapped to the functional unit. So you have schedulers that connect to your reorder buffer that decide when a particular instruction should run on the functional unit. Well, different processors, we realized, have different designs for these schedulers. So if you look at an Intel processor, you have these different functional units, and you have a unified scheduler that schedules instructions from a large queue, from a large reorder buffer onto these functional units. In AMD, if you look at some of their documentations, you'll see that, well, they have a distributed scheduler design. So they have independent scheduler queues in which a new instruction comes and sits in, and these scheduler queues are distinguished based on their instruction type. So for example, you might have a different queue for adds, you might have different queue for multiplies, you might have different queue for some other instruction. And why is this the case? Well, all of our processors are going to larger and larger instruction windows, so you have reorder buffer sizes of, I don't know, 300, 400, 500 entries, and it becomes extremely hard to have a really large queue that can store all of these instructions. And AMD processors since Zen 1 have adopted this kind of an architecture. And in fact, if you look at even the Apple's M1 or M2 CPUs, they also have a very similar architecture where the queues are distributed. Well, why is this important? Well, we thought, okay, these queues are different for different instructions. Can we spy on instructions exploiting these scheduler queues? And more precisely, contention on these shared scheduler queues. So let's imagine a situation where a thread model where we have a single physical core, where you have two logical cores or two threads running simultaneously, right? And on one thread you have the attacker process, and on the other thread you have a victim process that is running some instructions. Our goal here is to spy on multiply instructions in the victim code. Why multiply? I will come to that in a few slides, but let's just assume we want to spy when a multiply is being executed from a victim thread. Now, can we somehow leverage this scheduler queue contention to spy on these multiplies? To answer that, let's look a little bit more into the design of the AMD CPU and the scheduler queue. So you have threads, the instructions from two threads being fetched separately from, say instruction thread 1 and thread 2, and they are fetched and decoded separately, but they share these scheduler queues, right? So if you have a multiply from thread 1 and multiply from thread 2, both of them are going to reside in this single scheduler queue, and both of them are going to execute through this ALU1. That's how the hardware is designed, right? Specialization. So all of the multiplies from different threads map to the same scheduler queue and contend for the limited capacity of the scheduler queue. So can we somehow use this contention to spy on multiplies of one thread from another thread, right? This is problematic because, well, if the two threads belong to different users or different VMs in the cloud, you can actually leak the computations of one VM or one process into another. So let's see how this might happen. So to exploit contention on this limited scheduler queue capacity, we basically cause a traffic jam at that scheduler queue. So imagine you have a IIT main gate signal, and you have a right turn. In this case, well, you have a left turn, and you have a straight signal as well, right? So imagine these are different queues, right? The left turn is one queue, and then the straight is another queue. And well, when the signal is open, everything is good, everybody is able to go quickly. But when there is a truck that just gets stuck in the signal, there is a traffic jam, right? But what is a traffic jam? Well, you can have some instruction like a square root that takes a really long time that basically stalls this functional unit, right? Think about it like a truck stuck in a pothole, right? Now what happens is, let's say you have multiplies that are trying to go through this traffic signal. Here we have this set of instructions where we have two multiplies sandwiched between read PRUs. Read PRUs are instructions that basically let you read the timer from the CPU, right? Like a counter that just tells you the cycle count at the current instance. So it's basically like a timer instruction. So let's say we have a read PRU to multiply and then a read PRU. Read PRU is mapped to this queue, and then the multiply is mapped to this queue. In this case, multiplies are very nicely occupying just the capacity of the of ALU Q1, and so the read PRUs can freely go through the main queue, right? There is no slowdown for these read PRUs, and the delta time that you measure between these two read PRUs is quite small, right? Because, well, they just pass through the execution. But now let's say you had more multiplies than the capacity of this queue. The capacity was only 2, but now you had 3 multiplies. What's going to happen? Well, the first read PRU goes through quickly. The first multiply comes, the second multiply comes, and now it's blocked, right? There's a traffic jam. This multiply has nowhere to go, right? It can't go here because that's not what that's not the queue. It needs to map to this queue. So it's just stuck waiting for the multiplies to finish. Now what happens to the read PRU? Well, the read PRU can't go ahead because it's just stuck waiting behind the multiplier. So here, if you observe the delta t that from the time that you measure with this and time that you measure with this read PRU, you're going to get a really large time difference. You basically get a pipeline stall here, right? So the delta t that you get is like of the order of a few thousand cycles, right? Basically the latency of a pipeline stall. And so with this timing difference, now you can actually measure how many multiplies are being executed, right? If the multiplies are more than the capacity of the queue, you're going to see a large timing difference between the two read PRUs. If the multiplies are less than the capacity, then there's no timing difference. There's no the time measured is very small. So we try to use this construction to simply measure the capacity of the queue, right? So shown here on the x-axis is the same code that we wrote previously. The only thing that is varying is the number of multiplications that are sandwiched between the two read PRUs. The y-axis shows the delta t reading from our experiment, and the blue line is with Zen 2, the red line is with Zen 3. You'll notice that the blue line has a sharp jump around 16 multiplies, right? Basically means that the capacity of the queue is 16 for Zen 2. For Zen 3, we saw that jump around 22 or 23. And if you look at the documentation of these processors, they actually say that the capacity of their queues is 16 or 23. So our hypothesis is actually working. We can in fact measure the capacity of the queue and whether the queue is full or not full with this construction. And notice that the Intel curve, which is the green one, Intel Comet Lake, is actually flat, right? That basically shows that the difference in the architecture is that the queue is in fact shared across all the instruction types. So we are not seeing a jump, at a small value of multiplications. So okay, we can spy on the hardware itself, like we can now know that whether we are within the capacity or not. But how is this useful, right? Why is this important from a security standpoint? Well, one thing that you can do is you can use this to transmit information, right? Like, so covert channel is a covert channel attack is an attack where you have two processes, a spy and a Trojan, and the Trojan has some secret that it wants to transmit to the spy, and you can't do it by just opening up a port, right? Because this, ports are easily monitorable by the software. So the idea is to use microarchitectural contention to in fact transmit bits of ones and zeros. So here we construct, using a very similar spy code, we basically use the delta t variation to transmit whether you're sending a 0 or a 1. So if you want to if the Trojan wants to transmit a bit 0, they don't do any multiplies, and then if the Trojan wants to transmit a 1, they do 1 multiply. And in the spy code, the number of multiplies just about fills the capacity of the queue. So when there is no multiply, the queue is not full or just about full, there is no traffic jam, so the delta t measured is small. If there is at least even one multiply from the Trojan side, there is going to be a traffic jam, the delta t measured is going to be large, and so you can in fact just transmit information from one process to the other just without any direct communication, just with these contentions, right? Okay, so you can do something useful, moderately useful, but well, there are so many channels that you can contend on, right? Like there is caches, there is scheduler queues, there is maybe some other ways of transmitting information. Why is this important? Well, it's actually important because multiplies are in fact used in a lot of sensitive computations. So if you have studied a security course or crypto course, you'll be familiar with an RSA algorithm, which is basically a encryption algorithm used in public key cryptography, right? So if you use SSH, you typically might use an algorithm like RSA to either decrypt data using your private key or encrypt data with your public key and so on, right? I said that wrong. Encrypt or decrypt data with your private key and or sign your messages with your private key. So in the computations like the encryption that you do with RSA, it's basically a 4,000 bit key that you have, and every bit, there is a popular algorithm called an RSA square multiply algorithm, where to do the encryption you run a for loop and say, okay, if the bit value of the key is 0, I only do a square of my intermediate result, and if the bit value is 1, then I not just do a square but also a multiply, right? And this is how you construct the ciphertext from the plain text iteratively. Why is this important? Well, if based on your key bit value you are performing a multiply or not performing a multiply, now a spy can actually monitor whether your code is performing a multiply or not performing a multiply each iteration of this for loop, and in fact leak out the key bit by bit, right? So we actually use this scheduler queue contention or SQUIP to monitor the multiplies with the RSA algorithm to leak out the key bit by bit. So shown here is the just our proof of concept attack on the RSA algorithm. The x-axis basically shows samples taken by the spy's code with the same sandwiched multiplication code sequence, and so yeah, we keep taking samples across time, and meanwhile the victim is performing this multiply operation, square multiply operation, bit by bit. So it's running the for loop, and then the y-axis shows the delta t that is measured by the SPI. It's a moving average to smoothen the curve, but essentially it's an indication of delta t. So what you'll observe is that there are peaks, right, periodically, and these peaks basically correspond to the ones in the key. So whenever the key bit value is 1, the SPI observes a ton of contention that leads to a large delta t value, and then periodically you also have these troughs, right, the valleys. They basically correspond to the 0 bits. We know how much time each iteration of the RSA algorithm is supposed to take. So if we get a prolonged valley, we know how many zeros it corresponded to. So by just monitoring this temporally, you can leak out the entire key bit by bit, just by looking at contention. And this is of course noisy, so we need to repeat this attack. With just about 50,000 repetitions, we are able to extract the entire key with very low errors. So if you look at this metric called edit distance, that looks for how many bits of error you have in a string. Across a 4,000 bit key, we have about 5 bits of error on average when we do this across processes, and when we do this across VMs, the error increases a little bit to about 18 bits. But this is still a significant amount of key that got leaked, right? Like out of 4096, you have leaked out maybe 4070 bits, right? At that point, the space to search for the key is actually very, very small. So this is a fairly serious leakage. Now, of course, no one uses the RSA square and multiply algorithm because, well, it has this known problem. But it's a strawman example. You could have other algorithms that have similar secret dependent multiply usage, and they would be vulnerable in the same manner. So the impact that this work had was that, well, we reported this to AMD and we got a CVE, and essentially bunch of processors were affected, right? We did this on Zen 2 and Zen 3, but AMD told us that, well, Zen 1 is also affected, and they didn't comment about Zen 4, which is coming out, but I would suspect that that also is affected because essentially it is exploiting the same architecture design, right? So the only way to mitigate this in hardware is to move away from shared scheduler queues, and so either you go to unified scheduler like Intel, but that of course leads to performance and maybe power penalties, or you partition the scheduler queues between threads so that the contention or usage of the queue from one thread is not observable from the other thread based on latency difference. Okay. The software, I mean, this of course takes a long time to implement because you need to change the architecture, there might be performance implications and so on and so forth. The fix in the short term is basically from software. Just don't map distrusting threads to the same physical core, and that should be okay. So, yeah, question? Depends on how you implement your code. If you have implemented your square as a multiply, then yes, it will cause some leakage. So the problem is not multiply itself. The problem is that you're doing secret dependent. You are doing a different number of multiplies based on the secret, right? If the secret is 0, you're doing 0 multiply. If the secret is 1, you're doing 1 multiply. If you say replace the square with just multiplications, in that case you would be doing maybe 1 multiplication here versus 2 multiplications here, right? That still leaks information, right? So it's not the fact that there is a multiplication, it's the fact that it's a secret dependent variation in the multiplications. Yeah. So the timer instruction, you mean? It can. So the critical part is that
because it's in different.
So the reordering only happens once the instruction is sitting inside the scheduler, right? It depends. So if you look at the pipeline, the fetch stage and the decode stage are in order, right? It's only at the execute stage or when you're already occupying scheduler resources can you in fact have out of order execution or reordering, right? Here the second read period has not even reached the scheduler. It's just sitting in the fetch or decode stage, right? At that point, if your scheduler queue is full and you have no room to put this instruction, you basically have to stall all the prior stages of the pipeline. You have to stall the fetch and decode stage. So this doesn't even have the ability to be scheduled, right? So it can't be reordered. Make sense? Yeah.
So there's a similar instruction, I think that I refer correctly, RDTAC, and it has a special semantics that all the instructions before that will be executed before this instruction is scheduled. So that's why it cannot be reordered.
So RDTSC, so there's two instructions in Intel ISA. There's RDTSC and there's RDTSCP. So the P1, the one with the P is the one that has some ordering guarantees, and the ordering guarantees are also with respect to loads, to my knowledge. It can still be reordered with respect to say other instructions like multiply, but not with load. So in Intel, if you wanted to do the same thing, we would probably still be able to do it. The hard part is that, well, there is no different scheduler queue based on the instruction type. So we really can't get contention on this, one scheduler queue that's only having multiplies, right? So we can't measure the contention for multiplies individually. So that's the challenge why we were not able to pull this off on Intel. Okay. So the takeaway here from both Mirage and from Squip is that, well, security has become very crucial for systems and hardware. In the past decade, it was okay to think about security just at the software layer, but today you don't have secure software, secure hardware. You really have secure systems, right? And if hardware is the weak link, then that is the weak link that is going to get exploited. So we need security for hardware. But to get security, we need a lot of cross-domain expertise, right? We need people who are understanding the architecture and who can, come up with new attacks and understand the threat landscape well. And we also need people who understand, how defenses can be designed, right? And so that you not only design practical defenses that are easy to implement, but also durable defenses, right? Like that can stay resilient to evolving attacks. And so I think the takeaway that I would like to give you is you really need to move outside of silos and think across layers, right? Think about security across layers, try to come up with solutions across layers, and yeah, I think that's the only way to get security. I'll just conclude by maybe giving a quick overview of some of the work we're doing at Toronto. I talked a lot about side channels that leak information. There's also another big threat in terms of fault injection that we are facing in hardware. This problem of row hammer, right, in DRAM. So the challenge is that, well, DRAM has become so dense that the cells are packed close to each other so closely that when you access one cell, you in fact leak some charge from a neighboring cell. So if you access one cell repeatedly, rapidly in a short period of time, you can leak out enough charge out of neighboring cells that you see bit flips in the neighboring cells. And the problem is that the vulnerability levels have increased like 30x in the last 5 to 10 years. You initially had bit flips with about 140k accesses, 140,000. Now in today's DRAM we have it with just 5,000. And it's dropping even further. So it's actually a big problem right now. And some of the work that I've done in the past has focused on designing scalable defenses, new tracking mechanisms to detect attacks, new mitigation mechanisms to make the charge leakage more limited, and also defense in depth techniques. Some of my students right now are exploring demonstrating this attack on newer hardware. So far a lot of the attacks have been demonstrated on CPUs, but DRAM is DRAM. You have GPUs that use DRAM, you have accelerators that use DRAM. So we are trying to demonstrate these attacks on newer hardware, and at the same time we are also coming up with low cost defenses to make the attack harder and harder to pull off on existing hardware. So if this interests you, talk to me. This is, I think, a very important area of research, not just in hardware but also for systems and for security. The other direction that some of my students are looking at is trying to detect these side channels in an automated manner, because as I said, the threat landscape is quite large, and with every new generation you add a lot of new features, right? And you need to be able to understand if there are vulnerabilities while you're designing them, right? Because if you've already designed, fabricated, deployed these systems and then you discover these vulnerabilities, it's too late, right? Because it's only going to get fixed maybe after 10 years. We are trying to detect some of these vulnerabilities at design time using both empirical approaches like fuzzing, but also more formal methods to reason about this in a more principled manner. And lastly, our most valuable compute right now is machine learning, and machine learning models are programmed very differently, but they also still run on the same hardware. So whether it is C code or whether it is Python code running machine learning models, the attacks are almost the same. But there is a new opportunity to make these machine learning models more resilient to microarchitectural attacks by leveraging domain-specific techniques like retraining the model or adding some additional mitigations that leverage the memory access patterns in machine learning models and so on. So by using these domain-specific techniques, we are trying to make machine learning models more secure to these microarchitectural attacks, and also trying to discover what is the worst things that we can do by using these microarchitectural attacks. Like, can we have privacy leakages? Can we leak out the model? Can we make some of the existing ML attacks worse with the additional information about the microarchitecture? So it's an exciting time to be working at the layer of hardware. Last slide, this is the university at Toronto. If you're thinking about grad school, this is a great place to come, and we are hiring masters and PhD students. So if you're in the market for grad school, please come talk to me. Thanks for taking time out today. I'm happy to take any questions. Absolutely. So you can have a single queue that stores all kinds of instructions, right? And that is what Intel does. Intel has been doing. But the challenge is that if you have a single really large queue, maybe that works for 100 instructions or 200 instructions. Okay. Okay.
We have, let's say, 10 instructions. All the queues are handling all the 10 instructions.
I see. So you could do that, but I would imagine that it becomes harder to design your logic, right? Because if you, it becomes the same problem as set-associative and fully associative caches, right? If there is a single place where you can go, it's easy to design the circuit to, take the instruction, check the type and put it in this queue, right? If it needs to go to any queue, now you need to have the wires to send it to any of the several queues. And now, it's not just the sending, right? It's also the removal from those queues. There's only going to be maybe 1 or 2 functional units that can do multiplies, right? If all of the queues can now send the instructions to that 1 or 2 functional unit, the logic to figure that out is going to be extremely complex. So that's the downside of trying to make it not have this dependence of instruction type. You could, but then you run into the same problem, right? Where a multiply could be sitting anywhere in any of the queues, right? So if you need to remove a multiply from Q0 versus Q5, you need to have the logic to schedule multiplies from each of these queues to the functional unit in each of these queues, right? So it's identical whether you're, randomizing it or, sending it to any one of the queues at, giving, it is essentially like giving one multiply the flexibility to go to any of the queues, right? It's identical to that. So yeah, I think, so one of the techniques that makes this attack slightly harder is that newer Zen have something called watermarking, where they say that the queue is not statically partitioned, it could be dynamically partitioned to the extent that, let's say, one thread can occupy 75% of the queue, but no more, right? So as long as the two threads are occupying less than 75% each, they share freely. But when one queue tries to, fully flood the, one thread tries to fully occupy the queue, at that point it gets like a hard limit, and there is some space left over for the other, the thread to use, right? So it makes it harder, but not impossible. So yeah, I think going forward, probably static partitioning, or at least having the ability to statically partition if the software wants that to be the case, is probably going to be the principal way to fix this. Yeah.
So you talked about formalizing mitigation of flaws in the hardware in real life.
Yeah.
Is it like formalizing that technique for each of the attacks that is present, or
So in this, so you're talking about this particular project. So yeah, so the idea here is to focus on a broad class of attacks. So right now we are doing this primarily for transient execution attacks, or basically this processor speculation based attacks like Spectre, Meltdown and their variants. So we are basically looking at that broad class of attacks and trying to model those attacks in the form of properties that the hardware needs to guarantee to the software to make sure that you don't leak additional information because of processor speculation than you would leak without processor speculation. So there are these properties that people have proposed called speculative non-interference. So we are basically trying to model those properties in simulators and try to check if that gets violated in a given defense, a given program, etc. Yes. So the property is independent of the implementation. It basically says that, well, if you have an in-order processor and without speculation and you leak certain amount of information, the out-of-order processor that with speculation should leak no more information than the in-order processor. Whether a given out-of-order processor meets that property or not is not what the property says, right? That's the goal of the hardware designer, to design such hardware or prove that the hardware actually meets that property and so on. And I think that's an open research problem right now, which is what we're targeting. Mm-hmm.
There's still things that are known, right? That's why we're doing more and more new translate encryption attacks. You don't know where exactly things are from.
Yeah.
And so even if you assume that, okay, this part of microarchitecture is actually respected by another commodity, if there is something else, somewhere else, which can create side effects, and eventually it can actually get into a situation where it no longer respects your
Yeah, so that's a good point, right? I think a question to ask is why are we seeing new and new variants come up when we thought that it's over? The biggest reason is that A, companies don't reveal their inner workings of their processor, and B, none of those designs are actually validated against these properties, right? Well, not blaming them because we have only started developing these properties last year, right? So going forward, the vision is that if we are able to develop not just these properties but also tools to validate them on either a simulator or RTL or something more detailed, companies can actually take those tools and do it on their internal designs and at least get this visibility of how secure are they and what additional things they need to do to be secure, right? Currently they don't even have the tools, right? And I was talking to somebody at Intel, and this was like 3-4 years ago. They said, well, each time I write a patent for a new performance optimization, I have to say how this is going to impact security. And right now they have no way to say, formally what is the security impact, right? They just say, maybe this corner case exists and I have handled this, right? Same happens in research papers, right? Somebody comes up with a defense and a grad student says, I have analyzed this 5 different corner cases and hence I am secure. And then somebody else comes along and runs the code and says, I discovered some more corner cases and hey, your defense is broken, right? So you want to get out of this, security by manual inspection and make this more of an automated process so that designers of systems can in fact reason about the security of their defense in an automated manner, and if they discover holes at the design time, they can actually plug it then and there. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
This is like matching one kind of attack or one sort of one class of attack, and then once you put this so-called secure processor, let's say along with secure other ABC classes, suddenly they may start giving conflict.
So you're absolutely right. So we can't reason about the security of just the core in isolation, right? You really have to analyze it along with all of the other parts of the uncore also, right? Like say caches or memory, and you need to at least have models of those, right? And same goes for performance, right? We can't say you can have a dumb core model that says, hey, my prefetch, my branch predictor is going to give me 100% speed up, but after you have caches and DRAM, your just performance drops, right? So
But that is only there in my class.
yeah. So that's the idea, right? Like, so the goal is that we build these tools that can reason about this not just inside the core but for a system. And well, Gem5, a simulator like Gem5 or FireSim would have all of those components, even at some whatever level of description. If we can reason about those at that level, then maybe companies would adopt it and do it for their own internal systems. All right, thank you.